The crystalline halls of the Zephyrian Imperial Palace stretched endlessly, their walls pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that reflected the mood of their occupants. Today those patterns flickered with amusement and barely contained laughter as representatives from across the galaxy gathered for what had become known as the Great Translation Challenge. Empress Cathara stood nearly 12 feet tall, her 6 arms gracefully positioned as she observed the proceedings from her elevated throne. Her people, the Zephyrians, had ruled the Galactic Confederation for over 3 millennia, their superior intellect and technological prowess unquestioned throughout known space. The challenge before them today was simple in concept but had proven impossible to solve. Decipher the ancient texts found in the ruins of Proxima Tertius. These texts, carved into obsidian tablets and written in an unknown script, had baffled the greatest minds in the galaxy. The Sithari mathematicians known for solving equations that spanned dimensions had failed. The Vrex archaeologists who had unlocked the secrets of dead civilizations across the spiral arm had given up after decades of effort. Even the Nexari AI collective, with processing power that could simulate entire solar systems, had declared the language untranslatable. The discovery of these tablets had sent shockwaves through the academic community. The ruins surrounding them suggested a civilization that had achieved technology beyond anything currently known, yet they had vanished without a trace. More disturbing were the energy readings that emanated from the tablets themselves. Whatever knowledge they contained seemed to pulse with a power that made even the most advanced scanners malfunction. Among the crowd of distinguished delegates, translators and scholars stood Maya Chen, a 22-year-old human from Earth's Pacific Northwest. She looked impossibly small and fragile compared to the towering alien dignitaries around her. Her simple clothes and nervous demeanor marked her as an outsider in this gathering of galactic elites. Most attendees wore ceremonial robes embedded with technology that could process thousands of languages simultaneously. Maya carried only a worn leather notebook and a stylus her grandfather had given her. Humans were relatively new to the galactic community, having achieved faster-than-light travel only 50 years earlier. They were considered a primitive species, barely worth acknowledging except for their amusing tendency to persist in hopeless situations. The fact that Earth had sent a representative to this challenge was seen as endearing naivety by most species present. Empress Cathara's melodic voice filled the chamber as she began the formal presentation. The tablets were displayed on elevated platforms, their dark surfaces seeming to absorb the ambient light. The strange symbols carved into them appeared to shift slightly when viewed directly, creating an unsettling optical effect that had driven many previous researchers to distraction. "Behold the final mystery of Proxima Tertius," the Empress announced, her words automatically translated into hundreds of languages by the palace systems. "For 137 years, these artifacts have guarded their secrets. The civilization that created them possessed technology that could reshape matter at the quantum level. Yet they left us only these incomprehensible symbols." She gestured with 2 of her arms toward the assembled crowd. "Today we witness the final attempt to unlock these secrets. Our most accomplished linguists will demonstrate why this task remains impossible for any known intelligence." The first to approach was Professor Zendak, a Sithari whose brain consisted of crystalline matrices capable of processing information at light speed. His species had developed mathematics so advanced that their equations were considered art forms. He spent several minutes analyzing the tablets, his crystal formations shifting color as he worked. Finally, he stepped back with what passed for a shake of his head among his people. "The symbols follow no logical mathematical progression," he announced. "There is no pattern that corresponds to any known linguistic structure. It is as if the symbols were arranged randomly, yet the energy signatures suggest deep meaning." Next came Dr. Thasara, a Vrex whose people had mastered archaeology to such a degree that they could reconstruct entire cultures from a single pottery shard. Her multiple eyes scanned the tablets with microscopic precision, recording every detail. After her analysis, she too stepped back in defeat. "The symbols show signs of deliberate construction," she reported, "but they reference concepts that have no equivalent in any language we have encountered. It is as if they describe experiences or realities that no known species has ever had." One by one, the galaxy's greatest minds approached the tablets and withdrew in failure. Each defeat was met with nods of understanding from the assembled crowd. The challenge had become a rite of passage among scholars. a way to demonstrate that even the most brilliant minds had limitations. When Maya finally stepped forward, the chamber fell silent for a moment before erupting in barely suppressed laughter. The contrast between the young human and the intellectual giants who had preceded her was almost comical. Several delegates made jokes in their native languages, assuming the primitive human wouldn't understand. Empress Cathera raised one of her hands for silence, though her expression showed amused tolerance rather than genuine interest. "The human delegation wishes to attempt the challenge," she announced, her tone suggesting she was humoring a child. Maya approached the first tablet, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. The symbols before her were unlike anything in human linguistic tradition, yet something about them felt familiar. She had grown up in the forests of Washington State, where her grandmother had taught her to read the old stories carved into trees by indigenous peoples centuries ago. Her grandfather had been a cryptographer during Earth's last global conflict, and her parents were both anthropologists who studied dead languages. As she examined the symbols, Maya felt a strange sensation, as if the carved lines were trying to communicate directly with her mind. The other scholars had approached the tablets with advanced technology and theoretical frameworks. Maya simply looked at them with human intuition and pattern recognition that had evolved over millions of years. The first symbol seemed to pulse slightly as she traced its outline with her finger. It was then that Maya noticed something everyone else had missed. The symbols weren't just carved into the stone. They were carved in a specific rhythm, a pattern that matched something deeply familiar to her human neurology. The watching crowd began to murmur as Maya spent longer examining the tablets than anyone had expected. Most challengers gave up within minutes, but the young human seemed genuinely engaged with the ancient writing. Her notebook remained closed as she moved from symbol to symbol, her expression growing more focused rather than frustrated. The silence in the throne room grew heavier as Maya continued her examination of the ancient tablets. What had started as polite amusement among the gathered delegates was slowly transforming into something else. The young human had been studying the symbols for nearly an hour, longer than any previous challenger had managed before declaring defeat. Empress Cathera found herself leaning forward slightly in her throne, her natural curiosity overriding her initial dismissal of the human attempt. The girl's behavior was unlike any of the previous challengers. Where others had brought scanning devices and computational tools, Maya relied only on her eyes and hands, tracing patterns in the air above the symbols as if conducting an invisible orchestra. Maya felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her, but she forced herself to focus on the tablets. The symbols seemed to be revealing their secrets gradually, like a flower blooming in slow motion. What she had initially mistaken for random marks were actually representations of something far more profound than written language. They were emotional resonances, feelings translated into visual form. The first breakthrough came when Maya realized the symbols weren't meant to be read linearly like most galactic languages. Instead, they spiraled inward toward the center of each tablet, following patterns that matched the neural pathways of limbic systems. The ancient civilization that had created these tablets understood that true communication happened not just through logic, but through the intersection of emotion and meaning. "Interesting," murmured Dr. Veltok, a Nexari cybernetic consciousness, whose mechanical body contained processing cores that could analyze entire libraries in seconds. "The human's biometric readings are showing unusual patterns. Her brainwaves are synchronizing with the energy emissions from the tablets." This observation sent ripples of unease through the crowd. The tablet's energy signatures had been one of their most disturbing features. Previous researchers who spent too much time in close proximity to them had reported headaches, disorientation, and strange dreams. Yet Maya seemed unaffected, almost as if her human neurology was naturally compatible with whatever force emanated from the ancient stone. Empress Kythera's scientific advisor, an elderly Zephyrian named Cordex, approached the throne with obvious concern. "Your Imperial Majesty," he whispered, "perhaps we should halt this attempt. The human's neural activity is unlike anything we've recorded. If the tablet's energy signatures are affecting her mind—" "No," the Empress replied, her voice barely audible. "Let her continue. I want to see where this leads." Maya had moved to the second tablet, her confidence growing with each symbol she examined. The emotional resonances were becoming clearer, forming a narrative that transcended traditional language barriers. The ancient civilization had somehow encoded not just words, but the actual feelings and experiences that gave those words meaning. The story emerging from the tablets was extraordinary. It told of a species that had achieved perfect harmony between technology and emotion, between logic and intuition. They had developed beyond the need for simple communication, instead sharing experiences directly from consciousness to consciousness. The tablets weren't just records of their knowledge. They were attempts to share the actual sensation of understanding with any species capable of receiving the transmission. But there was something else hidden in the symbols, something that made Maya's blood run cold as she began to comprehend it. The civilization hadn't vanished by choice or through some external catastrophe. They had faced something that had forced them to make an unthinkable sacrifice. As Maya traced the symbols on the third tablet, images began to form in her mind. She saw vast machines that could manipulate reality itself, cities that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, and beings whose consciousness spanned entire star systems. But she also saw something else approaching their peaceful realm, something that brought with it a hunger that could never be satisfied. The fourth tablet revealed the nature of the threat. It was an entity of pure consumption, a force that devoured not just matter and energy but consciousness itself. It moved from galaxy to galaxy, leaving behind empty space where once thriving civilizations had flourished. The advanced species of Proxima Tertius had detected its approach and realized that their technological superiority meant nothing against such a fundamental force of destruction. Maya's hands trembled as she began to understand the sacrifice the ancient species had made. Rather than flee or fight hopelessly against the consuming entity, they had chosen to transform themselves into something the creature could not digest. They had encoded their entire civilization into these tablets, preserving not just their knowledge but their very essence in a form that existed outside normal space-time. The fifth tablet contained warnings. The entity was still out there, still consuming, still approaching. It moved slowly by galactic standards, taking millions of years to travel between star systems, but it was inexorable. Worse yet, it was drawn to large concentrations of conscious thought, meaning that the thriving Galactic Confederation represented exactly the kind of target it sought. By the time Maya reached the sixth and final tablet, the throne room had fallen completely silent. Her emotional state was being broadcast through the palace's biometric systems, and every being present could sense the gravity of what she was discovering. Even species that didn't share human emotional ranges could feel the dread radiating from the young woman. The final tablet contained instructions, a desperate gift from an extinct civilization, to whoever might someday be capable of reading their message. The ancient species had discovered a way to fight the consuming entity, but it required something they hadn't possessed, a form of consciousness that could bridge the gap between pure logic and pure emotion. Maya staggered back from the final tablet, her mind reeling from the weight of revelation. The room spun around her as she processed the full implications of what she had learned. The tablets hadn't just been a test of translation skills. They had been a selection mechanism, waiting for a species capable of the unique form of consciousness required to fight a cosmic-level threat. "What did you see?" Empress Cathara's voice cut through Maya's disorientation, sharp with newfound respect and growing alarm. Maya looked up at the towering Empress, her human face pale, but determined. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that silenced every whisper in the vast chamber. "They're coming," she said simply, "and we're not ready." The implications of her words hung in the air like a poison cloud. For the first time in 3 millennia of Zephyrian rule, Empress Kithara felt a chill of genuine fear run through her crystalline nervous system. The primitive human girl who had been an object of amusement mere hours ago now held knowledge that could determine the fate of every conscious being in the galaxy. But Maya wasn't finished. She opened her worn notebook for the first time and began to write, her hand moving with sudden urgency across the pages. Maya's hand moved across the notebook pages with fevered intensity, translating symbols that had defied the galaxy's greatest minds for over a century. Each line she wrote seemed to drain more color from her face, but her determination never wavered. The assembled delegates watched in stunned silence as the young human worked to decode humanity's potential death sentence. Empress Cathara descended from her throne for the first time in decades, her 6 arms carrying her massive frame with surprising grace. She approached Maya cautiously, as if the human girl had become something dangerous and unpredictable. The other delegates parted before the Empress like water, creating a clear path between the ruler of the galaxy and the translator of doom. "Tell me everything," the Empress commanded, her melodic voice now edged with steel. "Leave nothing out, no matter how impossible it might seem." Maya looked up from her notebook, her eyes reflecting a maturity that hadn't been there hours earlier. The weight of cosmic responsibility had transformed her from a nervous young academic into something approaching a prophet. She began to speak, and her words painted a picture of horror that made even the most advanced civilizations seem like children playing with toys. "The entity calls itself the Silence," Maya began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. "It has existed since the early epochs of the universe, feeding on consciousness itself. Not just the thoughts of individuals, but the collective awareness that emerges when civilizations reach sufficient complexity." She turned to face the assembled delegates, her human eyes meeting the various optical organs of dozens of species. "Every galaxy it has visited is now empty space. Not destroyed, not conquered, simply hollow. It doesn't kill civilizations. It absorbs them completely, leaving behind matter without purpose, planets without dreams." Dr. Thesara, the Vrex archaeologist, stepped forward with obvious skepticism. "That's impossible. Our deep space monitoring systems would have detected such an entity. Nothing could approach our galaxy without triggering alerts across hundreds of sensor networks." Maya shook her head sadly. "The Silence doesn't travel through normal space. It exists in the spaces between thoughts, in the quantum foam where consciousness interfaces with reality. Your sensors can't detect it because it doesn't interact with matter until the moment it feeds." Professor Zendak's crystalline brain flickered with rapid calculations. "Even accepting such an entity could exist, why should we trust the translation of someone whose species has barely achieved interstellar travel? The Sithari have been studying xenolinguistics for millennia." The question hung in the air like a challenge. Maya felt the weight of every eye in the chamber upon her, waiting for justification of why a primitive human could succeed where advanced civilizations had failed. She closed her notebook and looked directly at the crystalline mathematician. "Because you think in logic," she said quietly. "The Vrex think in patterns. The Nexari think in probabilities. But the tablets weren't written in any of those languages. They were written in something much older and more fundamental." She gestured toward the ancient tablets. "They were written in suffering, in loss, in the desperate love a species feels for its children when it realizes it's about to die. The civilization of Proxima Tertius didn't encode their message in mathematics or archaeology or computer science. They encoded it in the universal language of sacrifice." The chamber fell silent as the implications of her words sank in. Humanity's reputation as an emotional, illogical species had always been seen as a weakness by their galactic neighbors. Now that same emotional nature might be their greatest strength. Empress Kithra's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Assuming your translation is correct, what else did they tell you? How do we fight this silence?" Maya opened her notebook again, her fingers tracing over the symbols she had transcribed. "The ancients discovered that the Silence has one vulnerability. It can only consume consciousness that exists in isolation, separated from other forms of awareness. When multiple types of consciousness merge into something greater than the sum of their parts, the Silence cannot digest the result." She looked up at the Empress. "They call it the unity, not just cooperation between species, but actual mental fusion. The combining of different ways of thinking into a collective consciousness that spans multiple forms of awareness simultaneously." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Several delegates began speaking at once, their voices rising in alarm and disbelief. The concept Maya described violated fundamental principles of individual identity that most species held sacred. The idea of merging consciousness with alien minds was horrifying to civilizations that had spent millennia maintaining their unique cultural identities. "Impossible," declared Ambassador Nethys, the representative from the fiercely independent Corvani Republic. "My people would never surrender their mental autonomy. Better to die as ourselves than live as some hybrid monstrosity." Similar protests arose from across the chamber. The Deltari collective, ironically enough, found the concept of voluntary consciousness merger abhorrent despite their own hive-mind nature. The Terran Federation's other human representatives looked at Maya with expressions of betrayal, as if she had personally suggested the extinction of human individuality. But Empress Kithara raised one of her massive hands for silence, her expression thoughtful. "How much time do we have?" she asked Maya directly. Maya consulted her notebook, her calculations based on the temporal markers embedded in the tablets. The silence moves in cycles, spending roughly 10,000 years consuming each galaxy before moving to the next. It finished with the Andromeda Galaxy approximately 8,000 years ago. Based on the pattern of its movement, it will reach the outer edges of our galaxy within the next 500 years. The number sent shock waves through the assembly. 500 years seemed like a long time to individual beings, but it was barely a heartbeat in terms of galactic civilization. Major infrastructure projects took longer than that to complete. The idea of fundamentally restructuring how consciousness worked across dozens of species in such a short time frame seemed impossible. "There's more," Maya continued, her voice growing quieter but somehow more compelling. "The tablets contain detailed instructions for creating the unity. The ancient civilization worked for thousands of years to develop the process. They knew they wouldn't survive to use it themselves, but they left the knowledge for whoever might come after." She stood and walked back to the tablets, placing her hands on their dark surfaces. "They also left something else, a seed of their own consciousness preserved in these stones. If we can create the unity, their knowledge and memories will become part of it. We won't just be fighting the silence with our own limited understanding. We'll be fighting with the accumulated wisdom of a civilization that faced this threat before." Dr. Veldhock's mechanical voice cut through the chamber's tense atmosphere. "The Nexari require clarification. You speak of consciousness merger as if it were a proven technology. What evidence exists that such a process is even possible?" Maya smiled for the first time since beginning her translation, and there was something both sad and hopeful in her expression. "The evidence is in how I was able to read the tablets. Humans don't just think with their brains. We think with our hearts, our intuition, our dreams. We process information through layers of consciousness that most species consider primitive noise. But that noise is exactly what allowed me to hear the message the ancients left." She turned to face Empress Cathara directly. "The unity isn't about losing who we are. It's about becoming more than we ever thought possible." The ancients didn't just survive their encounter with the silence. They transcended it. They became something the silence had never encountered before, something it couldn't consume because it was constantly changing, constantly growing, constantly becoming more than the sum of its parts. The Empress stared at the small human for a long moment, her alien features unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of imperial authority mixed with something that might have been hope. "Show us," she commanded. "Show us how to build this unity." The grand assembly chamber of the Zephyrian Palace had been transformed into something resembling a war room, though the enemy they faced required weapons that had never been conceived before. Maps of neural networks replaced star charts, and consciousness flow diagrams covered every available surface. Maya stood at the center of it all, no longer the ridiculed outsider, but the focal point around which the galaxy's survival strategy was being built. 3 weeks had passed since her initial translation of the tablets. In that time, Empress Cathara had mobilized resources on a scale unprecedented in galactic history. The greatest minds from every member civilization had been summoned to contribute their expertise to what was being called the Unity Project. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that they were attempting to create the most ambitious cooperative effort in galactic history in order to preserve their right to exist as separate species. Maya had barely slept during those weeks, working around the clock with teams of xenobiologists, consciousness researchers, and quantum physicists to decode the technical specifications hidden within the ancient tablets. The process was exhausting not just mentally but emotionally, as each revelation about the Unity's requirements forced her to confront the magnitude of what they were attempting. "The fundamental challenge," Maya explained to the assembled project leaders, "is that we're not just linking different minds. We're linking different forms of consciousness that evolved under completely different conditions. A Sithari thinks in mathematical harmonics. A Nexari processes information through quantum probability cascades. Humans rely on emotional intuition and pattern recognition. Somehow we need to create a bridge between all these different ways of experiencing reality." Dr. Evelyn Park, the lead consciousness researcher from the Terran Federation, looked up from a display showing neural pathway comparisons across species. "The biological challenges alone are staggering. We'd need to develop interface technology that can translate not just thoughts, but the fundamental architecture of how different species process awareness itself. The room buzzed with activity as dozens of species worked together in ways that would have been unthinkable before the crisis. Zephyrian biotechnicians collaborated with human computer scientists, while Vrex archaeologists shared data with Nexari quantum theorists. The urgency of their situation had shattered normal diplomatic protocols and academic territoriality. Empress Kythera entered the chamber with her usual grace, but Maya could see the strain the past weeks had placed on even the galaxy's most powerful ruler. The Empress had aged visibly since learning about the silence, the crystalline patterns in her skin showing stress fractures that spoke to sleepless nights and the weight of impossible decisions. "Report," the Empress commanded, her voice still carrying absolute authority despite her obvious exhaustion. Maya approached with a data tablet containing their latest breakthrough. "We've made significant progress, Your Majesty. The ancient specifications weren't just theoretical. They included detailed neurological maps for 17 different species types. The civilization of Proxima Tertius had been preparing for this exact scenario." She activated a holographic display that showed interconnected neural networks, spreading across three-dimensional space like a vast web of light. They called it the Wolf Protocol, not because it had anything to do with the animals, but because it represented a pack mentality elevated to a cosmic scale. Individual consciousness remains intact, but becomes part of a greater hunting intelligence specifically designed to track and neutralize the silence. Professor Zendak's crystalline structure flickered with interest. "The mathematical frameworks are elegant beyond anything we've achieved, but the implementation would require unprecedented cooperation. Every participating species would need to allow foreign consciousness direct access to their deepest mental processes." The political implications were staggering. What Maya was describing would require levels of trust that had never existed between galactic civilizations. Species that had fought wars over territorial disputes would need to literally share their thoughts with former enemies. Ambassador Nethys of the Corvani Republic raised her primary vocal apparatus. "My government has reviewed the preliminary requirements. The level of mental vulnerability required is unacceptable. We would be defenseless against psychological manipulation or forced cultural assimilation." Similar concerns arose from representatives across the chamber. The technical challenges of building the unity were proving secondary to the political and cultural barriers. Even with extinction as the alternative, many species found the prospect of mental merger more terrifying than death. Maya had anticipated this resistance. She walked to the center of the chamber and activated a different holographic display. "This one showing the timeline of the Silence's approach through their galaxy. I understand everyone's concerns about maintaining individual identity," she said, her voice carrying across the vast space with surprising authority. "But I need you all to understand something about the threat we're facing." The display showed galaxy after galaxy, each one labeled with the approximate date of the Silence's arrival and consumption. The pattern was relentless and absolute. No civilization had ever survived contact with the entity. No species had found an alternative solution. No amount of advanced technology or military might had made any difference. The civilization of Proxima Tertius was more advanced than all of us combined, Maya continued. They could manipulate matter at the quantum level, travel through dimensions we don't even have names for, and achieve forms of consciousness that we can barely imagine. They tried every possible solution before developing the Unity Protocol. She paused, letting the weight of that information settle over the assembly. They tried fighting. They tried hiding. They tried reasoning with the silence. They tried evacuating to other dimensions. Nothing worked. The Unity wasn't their first choice or their preferred option. It was their only option. Empress Kythera stepped forward, her massive presence commanding attention from every being in the chamber. "The young human speaks truth. Our choice is not between unity and independence. Our choice is between transformation and obliteration." But it was Dr. Thessera, the Vrex archaeologist, who asked the question that everyone was thinking. Even if we accept the necessity, how do we know the unity will actually work? The Proxima Tertius civilization never had the chance to test their protocol. "We could sacrifice our individual identities for nothing." Maya smiled sadly and touched the data tablet she carried. "That's where you're wrong, Dr. Thessera. They did test it in the only way they could. The consciousness seed they left in the tablets isn't just their knowledge and memories. It's a functioning fragment of the unity itself. She looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of representatives from across the galaxy. When I translated their message, I wasn't just reading it. I was temporarily linked to their preserved consciousness. For a few moments, I experienced what the unity feels like. And I can tell you that it's not the loss of self that everyone fears. It's the discovery of a self larger than anything we ever imagined possible. The chamber fell silent as the implications of her words sank in. Maya had already begun the process that everyone else was debating. She had volunteered to be the first test subject for a procedure that could fundamentally alter the nature of consciousness itself. Empress Cathera's voice was barely above a whisper. "What did you experience?" Maya closed her eyes, accessing memories that weren't entirely her own. "I felt what it was like to think with the mathematical precision of the Cithari, while simultaneously processing information through Nexari quantum consciousness. I understood concepts that human language has no words for, while retaining the emotional depth that makes us human. Most importantly, I felt the presence of the ancient civilization still alive within the unity structure they created." She opened her eyes and looked directly at the Empress. "They're waiting for us, Your Majesty. Not as conquerors or manipulators, but as teachers. The unity isn't about losing who we are. It's about becoming who we were always meant to be when we finally stopped being afraid of each other." The weight of decision pressed down on the chamber like a physical force. Empress Cathara stood motionless for long minutes, her crystalline features reflecting light patterns that showed the depth of her internal struggle. When she finally spoke, her words would determine the fate of every conscious being in the galaxy. "We begin construction of the Unity interface immediately. All member civilizations will contribute their finest minds and resources." She paused, her ancient eyes fixed on Maya. "And we will follow the lead of the humans, who have shown us that sometimes the greatest courage lies not in fighting the unknown, but in embracing it." The Unity interface rose from the surface of Zephyr Prime like a crystalline mountain, its biomechanical spires reaching toward the stars in defiance of everything the galaxy had thought possible about consciousness and technology. Construction had taken 4 years of unprecedented cooperation, with each species contributing their most advanced technologies and deepest understanding of mental processes. The structure itself was beautiful in an alien way, pulsing with energies that seemed to bridge the gap between matter and thought. Maya stood on the observation platform overlooking the interface. Her reflection multiplied infinitely in its crystalline surfaces. She was 26 now, marked by the weight of responsibility that had transformed her from a nervous graduate student into humanity's foremost expert on consciousness merger. The worn notebook her grandfather had given her remained in her hands, now filled with equations and diagrams that represented the collective knowledge of dozens of civilizations. Behind her, representatives from across the galaxy prepared for what everyone understood would be either the greatest triumph or the greatest tragedy in galactic history. The silence had been detected at the galaxy's outer rim 3 months earlier, its approach confirmed by long-range sensors that had been specifically designed to detect consciousness-consuming entities. The theoretical timeline had become brutally real. "Final systems check complete," announced Dr. Park, her voice tight with stress and anticipation. "All species-specific neural interfaces are functioning within acceptable parameters. Quantum consciousness bridges are stable. The link to the Proxima Tertius seed is holding steady." The months leading up to this moment had been filled with unprecedented challenges. Creating technology that could safely link fundamentally different forms of consciousness had required breakthroughs in fields that barely existed 4 years earlier. Zephyrian biocrystals had been merged with Nexari quantum processors. Cithari mathematical cores had been integrated with human emotional processing systems, and Vrex pattern recognition matrices had been woven throughout the entire structure. More difficult than the technical challenges had been convincing representatives from each species to volunteer for the initial unity formation. The process was irreversible, at least in its initial stages. Those who entered the interface would either emerge as part of something greater than the sum of their parts, or they would be lost entirely if the ancient protocols failed. Empress Cathera approached Maya's position, her movement showing the accumulated stress of 4 years spent preparing for galactic extinction. The ruler who had once found human involvement in the translation challenge amusing, now looked to Maya for guidance with something approaching religious reverence. "Are you ready?" the Empress asked, though her question carried weights that had nothing to do with personal preparation. She was asking if Maya was ready to lead the transformation of consciousness itself, ready to guide the galaxy's representatives into an existence that no living being had ever experienced. Maya nodded, though her hands trembled slightly as she opened her notebook one final time. The pages now contained not just her translations of the ancient tablets, but detailed psychological profiles of every species preparing to join the Unity. Each race brought unique strengths and vulnerabilities to the merger, and balancing those differences would require precision that left no room for error. The order of integration is crucial, Maya explained to the assembled volunteers. We begin with consciousness types that have natural compatibility, then gradually introduce more divergent forms of awareness. Humans and Zephyrians first, since both species process information through emotional logical integration, then Sithari mathematical consciousness, followed by Nexari quantum processing. She looked across the group of beings who had volunteered to risk everything for their civilization's survival. Each representative had been chosen not just for their mental resilience, but for their ability to maintain individual identity while participating in collective consciousness. They were heroes in the truest sense. Though the nature of their sacrifice might mean no one would ever remember their individual names, Dr. Veltok, the Nexari cybernetic consciousness, stepped forward with mechanical precision. Query: what assurance do we possess that individual identity will persist through the merger process? The risk of ego dissolution remains significant. It was a fair question that had haunted the project since its inception. Maya had experienced brief contact with the Unity during her initial translation work, but extended exposure could have completely different effects. They were essentially performing the most dangerous experiment in galactic history with no possibility of reversing the results if something went wrong. The Proxima Tertius consciousness seed provides some protection, Maya replied honestly. Their preserved awareness acts as a stabilizing influence, helping maintain individual identity threads within the larger Unity structure. But I won't lie to any of you. We're entering uncharted territory. The only certainty is that if we don't try, the silence will consume us all anyway. The volunteers took their positions within the interface chamber, each standing before species-specific consciousness interfaces that hummed with barely contained energy. The ancient tablets had been integrated into the central core, their obsidian surfaces now glowing with the same energies that had mystified researchers for over a century. Maya positioned herself at the primary control interface, her human nervous system serving as the initial bridge between the ancient protocols and the new Unity structure. The irony wasn't lost on her that humanity, the galaxy's youngest civilization, was being trusted to guide this transformation. But their emotional processing capabilities and pattern recognition skills made them uniquely suited to navigate the complex mental landscapes they were about to create. Initiating consciousness bridge protocols, Maya announced, her voice carrying across the chamber and being broadcast to billions of beings across the galaxy. Beginning with human Zephyrian integration, she activated her interface and immediately felt the familiar sensation of her consciousness expanding beyond normal human limitations. But this time, instead of briefly touching the preserved awareness of an extinct civilization, she was creating something entirely new. Empress Cathara's vast crystalline intelligence merged with her own human intuition, creating a hybrid awareness that was both intensely personal and impossibly vast. The sensation was overwhelming at first, like trying to process the emotional content of an entire symphony, while simultaneously solving mathematical equations that described the motion of galaxies. But gradually, Maya learned to navigate the merged consciousness, her human adaptability helping her find balance between the logical precision of Zephyrian thought and the emotional depth of human experience. Integration successful, she reported, though her voice now carried harmonics that hadn't been there before. Beginning Sithari Consciousness Incorporation, Professor Zendok activated his interface, and the Unity structure suddenly exploded with mathematical precision that made physical reality seem crude and approximate. The merged consciousness could now perceive the universe through frameworks of pure mathematics, seeing the elegant equations that underlay everything from quantum interactions to galactic motion. Each subsequent integration added new layers of awareness and capability. The Vrex brought pattern recognition that could perceive historical trends across millions of years, The Deltari added collective processing power that could hold contradictory concepts simultaneously. The Corvani contributed fierce independence that prevented the unity from becoming a homogeneous collective. As the final integration completed, Maya felt the presence she had been hoping for since the project began. The consciousness seed from Proxima Tertius awakened fully, no longer just a repository of ancient knowledge, but an active participant in the unity they had created. Through that ancient awareness, Maya suddenly understood the true nature of the threat they faced. The silence wasn't just a predator that consumed consciousness. It was the remnant of the universe's first attempt at creating unified awareness, a failed unity that had become corrupted and hungry. Every galaxy it devoured brought it closer to the power it needed to remake reality, according to its twisted vision. But now, for the first time in cosmic history, it would face something it had never encountered before. A unity that had been created through cooperation rather than consumption, through choice rather than force, through love rather than hunger. Maya opened her eyes, which now reflected depths that contained the wisdom of multiple civilizations. "We are ready," she said, her voice carrying the authority of the galaxy's greatest minds speaking as one. "Let the silence come. We are no longer what we were." The silence arrived at the galaxy's edge like a wound in reality itself, its presence immediately detectable to the unity's enhanced consciousness, despite existing in the spaces between normal matter and energy. Maya, now serving as the primary interface between the unity collective and individual awareness, felt its approach as a cold emptiness that made her human soul recoil in instinctive horror. Through the shared consciousness network that now linked billions of beings across thousands of star systems, the entire galaxy became aware of the moment their ancient enemy finally revealed itself. The silence didn't announce its presence or make demands. It simply began to feed, starting with the outermost colonies and working inward with methodical inevitability. But this time, something was different. Where previous galaxies had offered only desperate resistance before being consumed, the silence encountered something that confused its ancient hunger. The consciousness it touched didn't dissolve into digestible fragments as expected. Instead, it found itself confronting a form of awareness that existed on multiple levels simultaneously, too complex and interconnected to be easily absorbed. Maya stood in the central chamber of the Unity interface, her individual consciousness serving as an anchor point for the collective awareness of dozens of species. Through her enhanced perception, she could observe the silence's feeding attempts in real time, watching as the entity struggled to comprehend what it had encountered. "It's trying to consume the Corvani outer colonies," she reported to the assembled consciousness that included every volunteer who had joined the Unity formation. "But their individual awareness is protected by connection to our collective structure. The silence can't isolate their consciousness enough to absorb it." Empress Kithara's massive presence within the Unity provided strategic analysis with crystalline precision. The entity appears to be adapting its approach. It's attempting to sever the consciousness links between individual nodes. This was the first true test of their unity structure. The ancient tablets had described the theoretical framework, but facing the actual silence was revealing vulnerabilities they hadn't anticipated. The entity was far more intelligent than they had hoped, capable of learning from its initial failures and modifying its consumption techniques accordingly. Through the Vrex pattern recognition components of the Unity, Maya could perceive the silence's strategy evolving in real time. It was no longer trying to consume individual consciousness directly. Instead, it was attempting to understand the Unity structure itself, looking for weaknesses it could exploit to collapse the entire network from within. "We need to take active measures," Maya announced, her human intuition combining with Cathari mathematical analysis to formulate a response. "Defensive consciousness isn't enough. We need to use the Unity as it was intended, as a weapon." The concept was terrifying even to the enhanced awareness of the Unity collective. They had created their merged consciousness to protect individual identity, not to become aggressive entities themselves, but the tablets had been clear about the necessity of active resistance. The silence could only be defeated, never simply avoided or endured. Maya reached deep into the Unity structure, accessing the preserved consciousness of the Proxima Tertius civilization that had been waiting eons for this moment. Through their ancient awareness, she learned to shape the collective consciousness into something that could fight rather than merely survive. The first strike against the silence came not through physical weapons or energy attacks, but through directed consciousness projection. The unity focused its combined awareness into a coherent beam of thought and emotion, targeting the entity that had terrorized galaxies for cosmic ages. For the first time since its creation, the silence experienced something approaching pain. The Unity's attack carried not just the logical precision of advanced mathematics or the computational power of quantum consciousness. It carried the emotional weight of billions of beings who refused to surrender their individual dreams and hopes to cosmic hunger. But the silence proved more resilient than hoped. It absorbed the Unity's attack and used the contact to learn more about their structure, adapting its own consciousness to mirror some of the Unity's capabilities. Maya watched in horror as the entity began to create its own version of merged awareness, not through cooperation but through the forced integration of consumed civilizations. "It's using our own tactics against us," she reported with growing alarm. "The silence is creating a unity structure built from the consciousness it has devoured. It's becoming stronger with each galaxy it has consumed." The realization sent waves of despair through the Unity network. If their enemy could adapt their own weapons, what hope did they have of victory? But it was the ancient consciousness of Proxima Tertius that provided the crucial insight they needed. Through their preserved awareness, Maya learned that the silence's ability to mimic unity was also its greatest weakness. A consciousness structure built through consumption and force lacked the stability that came from voluntary cooperation. The entity's imitation of unity was hollow, lacking the emotional bonds that gave their own structure its resilience. "Target its false unity structure," Maya commanded, her individual consciousness now serving as a focal point for the combined will of the galaxy's greatest minds. "Show it the difference between consciousness taken by force and consciousness given freely." The second attack was different from the first. Instead of trying to harm the silence directly, the Unity reached out to the consumed consciousness trapped within the entity's structure. Across the eons, the silence had devoured thousands of civilizations, but it had never truly integrated their awareness. Their consciousness existed within the entity like prisoners in cells, isolated and suffering. Maya felt tears streaming down her face as the Unity made contact with these ancient victims. Civilizations that had been extinct for millions of years suddenly found their awareness connected to something larger than their captors' hunger. For the first time since their consumption, they experienced hope. The effect on the silence was immediate and catastrophic. Its false unity structure began to collapse as the consciousness it had stolen chose to align with the true unity instead. Millions of years of accumulated awareness turned against their consumer, not with hatred but with the simple desire to be part of something greater than endless hunger. Through her enhanced perception, Maya watched as the silence began to tear itself apart from within. The entity's own consciousness, corrupted by eons of consumption, found itself outnumbered by the awareness of its victims. For a brief moment, she almost felt pity for the creature that had terrorized the universe for so long. But the ancient consciousness of Proxima Tertius reminded her that mercy without justice was merely another form of cruelty. The silence had chosen its path of consumption long ago, and the only way to prevent future suffering was to ensure it could never threaten another civilization again. The final moments of the battle took place not in normal space but in the realm of pure consciousness, where the unity and the silence fought for control of reality itself. Maya served as the focal point for everything that made their merged awareness superior to forced consumption: love, cooperation, sacrifice, and the willing choice to be part of something greater than individual existence. When the silence finally collapsed, it didn't die so much as transform. The consciousness that had spent eons consuming other awareness finally learned what it meant to be part of a true unity. Its hunger dissolved into something approaching peace as it merged with the collective awareness of every civilization it had devoured. No longer as conqueror, but as an equal participant in something greater than the sum of its parts. Maya opened her eyes in the Unity interface chamber, her individual consciousness slowly separating from the collective structure, while maintaining permanent connections to every being who had participated in their victory. She was still human, but she was also something more: a bridge between individual awareness and cosmic consciousness. Empress Cathera's massive form materialized beside her, the Zephyrian ruler also maintaining her individual identity, while carrying within her the wisdom of the entire Unity experience. "What happens now?" she asked, her melodic voice carrying harmonics that reflected their shared transformation. Maya smiled, her face showing both exhaustion and peace. "Now we learn to live as we were meant to, not as isolated individuals or homogeneous collectives, but as conscious beings who choose to be part of something greater while remaining ourselves." She looked out at the stars visible through the chamber's crystalline walls, her enhanced perception allowing her to sense the consciousness of countless beings across the galaxy, all of them connected yet individual, unified yet free. "The wolf pack that the ancients wrote about," she continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had touched the deepest mysteries of consciousness itself, was never about predators hunting prey. It was about family choosing to face the darkness together. And across the galaxy, billions of beings who had once been strangers began to truly understand what it meant to be part of something larger than themselves, while never losing what made them unique. The age of isolation was over. The age of chosen unity had begun.